The year was 1988. Warner Brothers had scheduled a 2-hour meeting to discuss changes to Clint Eastwood's upcoming film, Bird. 14 studio executives gathered in the main conference room, armed with marketing research, demographic data, and a list of 47 proposed modifications they believed would improve the film's commercial prospects. Clint arrived with a single notebook. For 90 minutes he listened without speaking as executives presented their concerns. The film was too long, too dark. Charlie Parker's story was too niche for mainstream audiences. When they finished, Clint opened his notebook, wrote something down, then looked up and said, one line. The meeting ended immediately. The executives never asked for changes again, and that single line became legendary in Hollywood as the perfect response to corporate interference in artistic vision. The conference room on the 18th floor of the Warner Brothers Tower had been prepared for battle. 14 executives occupied seats around the massive table, representatives from marketing, distribution, finance, and production. Each had brought materials, printouts, graphs, research summaries, carefully prepared talking points. The subject of the meeting was Bird, Clint Eastwood's biographical film about jazz legend Charlie Parker. The film had been completed, and early screenings had generated concern among the studio's commercial analysts. It's not testing well with our target demographics, the head of marketing had warned in preliminary discussions. We need to address some issues before release. The executives had spent weeks compiling their concerns. The film was too long, 2 hours and 40 minutes in its current cut. The subject matter was too obscure. Jazz music didn't have the mainstream appeal of rock or pop. The tone was too dark. Charlie Parker's drug addiction and tragic death made for depressing viewing. The pacing was too slow. Modern audiences expected faster rhythms. 47 specific modifications had been identified. Some were minor, trimming a few minutes here and there. Others were substantial, restructuring the narrative, adding more accessible music, softening the film's unflinching portrayal of addiction. The executives were confident. They had data. They had research. They had the weight of the studio's commercial interests behind them. They were prepared for a negotiation. They were not prepared for what actually happened. Clint Eastwood entered the conference room at exactly 10 a.m. He wore simple clothes, no suit, no tie, nothing that signaled he considered this meeting particularly important. He carried a single notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. "Good morning," he said, taking a seat at the far end of the table. "Good morning, Clint. Thank you for joining us. You called the meeting. We have some thoughts about the film that we'd like to discuss." "I'm listening." The executives exchanged glances. Clint's demeanor was calm, neutral, impossible to read. He opened his notebook to a blank page and held his pen ready, as if preparing to take notes. "Should we begin?" the head of marketing asked. "Whenever you're ready." The first executive presented for 20 minutes. He covered the marketing research, focus groups, audience surveys, demographic analysis. The data suggested that Charlie Parker had limited name recognition outside jazz enthusiast circles. Mainstream audiences needed more context, more explanation of who Parker was and why he mattered. "We're recommending additional narration," the executive concluded, "something that helps viewers understand the significance of what they're seeing." Clint wrote something in his notebook. He didn't comment. The next executive addressed the film's length. 2 hours and 40 minutes is challenging for theatrical distribution, she explained. It limits the number of daily screenings, which affects our revenue potential. We believe a 20-minute reduction would substantially improve commercial viability without sacrificing the core narrative. She identified specific scenes that could be trimmed or removed entirely. Clint wrote something in his notebook. He didn't comment. The presentation continued. Each executive took their turn, laying out concerns that had been carefully documented and analyzed. The music. Too much jazz. Not enough variety. Modern audiences might respond better to contemporary songs mixed with the period-appropriate material. The addiction storyline. Too explicit. Too depressing. Could certain scenes be softened to make the protagonist more sympathetic? The ending. Too bleak. Charlie Parker's death at 34 left audiences without the uplift they expected from biographical films. Perhaps the ending could be restructured to emphasize his legacy rather than his passing. The love story. Underdeveloped. Audiences connected with romantic narratives. Expanding Chan Parker's role could provide emotional hooks that the current cut lacked. The historical context, insufficient. Viewers who didn't know the jazz world needed more information about the era, the music, the cultural significance. 47 recommendations, each supported by data, research, and commercial logic, each delivered with professional confidence. Throughout the presentation, Clint continued writing in his notebook. He asked no questions. He raised no objections. He simply listened and wrote. After 90 minutes, the presentation concluded. The executives sat back, satisfied with their thorough analysis. They had presented their case comprehensively, supporting every recommendation with evidence. Now it was time for discussion. "We understand this is a lot to consider," the head of production said, "but we believe these modifications would significantly improve the film's commercial potential while preserving its artistic integrity." Clint continued writing in his notebook. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The executives began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The silence was unexpected. They had anticipated pushback, negotiation, perhaps anger. Instead, they received nothing. Clint, the head of marketing, prompted, "Do you have any thoughts?" Clint finished writing. He looked up from his notebook. "I have one thought," he said. Clint Eastwood set down his pen. He looked around the table, making brief eye contact with each of the 14 executives who had spent 90 minutes explaining why his film needed to change. Then he said, one line, "Whose name is going on this picture?" The room fell silent. "Excuse me?" the head of production asked. "Whose name is going on this picture?" Clint repeated. "When the credits roll, whose name appears as director?" "Yours, obviously." "That's right. Mine." Clint closed his notebook. "So when the reviews come out, good or bad, whose name will be associated with those reviews?" "Yours." "And when audiences decide whether they like the film or not, whose vision will they be judging?" "Yours." "Exactly." Clint stood. "The film stays as it is. Thank you for your time." He walked toward the door. The executives sat frozen. The meeting had been scheduled for 2 hours. It had lasted 93 minutes, and for 90 of those minutes, Clint had said nothing. Then one line. Then he left. "That's it?" someone asked. "Apparently. He can't just walk out. We have legitimate concerns. He's Clint Eastwood. But the data doesn't matter if he won't implement changes. Should someone go after him?" The question Clint had asked hung in the air, unanswerable in any way that supported the executive's position. Whose name is going on this picture? The answer was obvious. And with that answer came an uncomfortable truth. If the film succeeded, Clint would receive the credit. If the film failed, Clint would bear the blame. The executives would move on to other projects, other analyses, other meetings where they presented data and made recommendations. Their names wouldn't be on the film. Their reputations wouldn't rise or fall based on its reception. Only Clint's would. And if that was the case, why should he accept changes he didn't believe in? Word of the meeting spread through the studio within hours. The story was too good not to share. 14 executives, 90 minutes of presentation, 47 recommendations, and Clint Eastwood ending it all with a single question. Whose name is going on this picture? The line became legendary. It was repeated in production offices, editing suites, and executive dining rooms. It was cited as the perfect response to corporate interference, elegant, unanswerable, and absolutely devastating. Some executives were embarrassed. They had spent weeks preparing for that meeting. They had compiled data, analyzed trends, and developed recommendations they genuinely believed would help the film succeed. And all of it had been dismissed with 8 words. Others were impressed. "You have to admire it." One admitted privately, "He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just asked a question that made everything we said irrelevant. Our concerns are valid. They might be valid, but they're not his concerns. And at the end of the day, it's his name on the film." Bird was released in September 1988. It was exactly as Clint had made it. 2 hours and 40 minutes of uncompromising biography, unflinching in its portrayal of Charlie Parker's genius and self-destruction. The film received critical acclaim. Reviewers praised its authenticity, its respect for the music, its refusal to sentimentalize or sanitize Parker's troubled life. Forrest Whitaker's performance was celebrated as transformative. The jazz sequences were hailed as some of the finest musical filmmaking ever produced. The commercial performance was modest. The film didn't break box office records. It wasn't the kind of mainstream hit that studio executives dreamed about. It found its audience, people who appreciated serious filmmaking, who wanted to understand Charlie Parker's world, who responded to art that challenged rather than comforted. The executives had been right about one thing. The film was too long, too dark, too niche for mass appeal. But they had been wrong about something more important. Not every film needed to appeal to the masses. Some films served different purposes: artistic purposes, cultural purposes, purposes that couldn't be measured in opening weekend grosses. Bird was that kind of film, and it existed exactly as its creator intended because Clint Eastwood had asked a simple question that nobody could answer. The meeting became a case study in creative control. Film students discussed it. Industry professionals referenced it. Aspiring filmmakers cited it as an example of how to maintain artistic integrity against corporate pressure. But the principle extended beyond that specific moment. Clint Eastwood had articulated something that applied to any creative endeavor. If your name is on the work, you bear responsibility for it. You receive the credit for success and the blame for failure. Your reputation rises or falls based on what you create. Given that reality, why would you compromise your vision to satisfy people who don't share that responsibility? The executives in that meeting had legitimate concerns. Their data was real. Their analysis was professional. Their recommendations were well-intentioned, but they weren't putting their names on the film. They weren't the ones who would be judged by history. They weren't the ones whose artistic legacy would be shaped by the decision. Clint was, and that made all the difference. Years later, someone asked Clint about the notebook he had carried into that meeting. "What were you writing the whole time?" "Nothing. Nothing. I was doodling, passing the time while they talked. But you had the notebook open. You kept writing things down. I wanted them to think I was taking their concerns seriously, that I was documenting their recommendations for future consideration. But you weren't. I knew before the meeting started that I wasn't changing the film. But I also knew that interrupting them would create conflict. So, I let them finish. Let them feel heard. Then I ended it. With one line. One line was all it took. Did you plan that line in advance? They had spent 90 minutes explaining why I should change my film to suit their commercial analysis, and I realized the simplest response was to remind them whose film it actually was. The meeting that ended early taught multiple lessons. For executives, it demonstrated the limits of corporate influence over genuine artists. Data and research were valuable tools, but they couldn't override creative vision when that vision was backed by a name that carried weight. For filmmakers, it illustrated the importance of reputation. Clint could end that meeting with one line because he had spent decades building credibility. A first-time director making the same statement would have been ignored or replaced. For everyone, it showed the power of the right question. The executives had presented arguments. Clint had asked a question. Arguments could be debated, countered, negotiated. But the question he asked had no good answer. None that supported the executive's position anyway. Whose name is going on this picture? The answer was always the same, and the implications of that answer made everything else secondary. The principle Clint demonstrated in that meeting applied far beyond filmmaking. In any creative endeavor, writing, music, art, design, the person whose name appears on the work bears ultimate responsibility for it. They receive the credit and the blame. Their reputation is shaped by the final product. Given that reality, accepting modifications you don't believe in becomes a form of self-sabotage. If the changes work, others take the credit for improving your vision. If the changes fail, you bear the blame for a compromised product. Either way, you lose. The only winning strategy is to create work you believe in, take full responsibility for the outcome, and let the results speak for themselves. That's what Clint did with Bird. That's what he did throughout his career. And that's why when 14 executives presented 47 recommendations, he could end the meeting with 8 words and walk out knowing he had made the right choice. Bird became a landmark in jazz cinema. It preserved Charlie Parker's music and story for generations who might never have encountered him otherwise. It influenced countless subsequent music biographies. It demonstrated that serious artistic filmmaking could coexist with the Hollywood studio system, if the filmmaker had sufficient conviction to protect their vision. But its most lasting legacy might be the meeting that didn't happen. The meeting where Clint Eastwood negotiated, where he accepted some changes and rejected others, where he compromised his vision to satisfy commercial concerns. That meeting never occurred, because one line ended everything. Whose name is going on this picture? The meeting ended early when Clint Eastwood said one line and closed his notebook. That line has been repeated thousands of times since, in film schools, business seminars, creative writing workshops, wherever people discuss the tension between artistic vision and commercial pressure. It endures because it captures something essential about creative responsibility. If you're not willing to put your name on something, you shouldn't make decisions about it. If you are willing to put your name on something, you shouldn't let others make decisions for you. The question cuts through complexity to reach fundamental truth. Whose name is going on this? Answer that question honestly, and most disputes resolve themselves. The person bearing responsibility should have authority. The person with authority should bear responsibility. When those two things align, decisions become clear. When they don't align, conflict is inevitable. Clint Eastwood understood this. That's why he could sit through 90 minutes of corporate recommendations without arguing. That's why he could end the meeting with 8 words. That's why his name went on Bird exactly as he intended. And that's why, decades later, people still tell the story of the meeting that ended early, when one line proved more powerful than 47 recommendations, and a closed notebook signaled that the discussion was over before it had really begun. The meeting ended early. The film remained unchanged, and the question continues to echo through every creative endeavor where artists face pressure to compromise their vision. Whose name is going on this picture? Answer that question, then make your choice.